And let's get back to our Father's Word with the Book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 15. And how are you doing? Then Esther bade them return Mordicai this answer: Go and gather together all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Notes. She's making a request that a prayer meeting lasting for 3 days and 3 nights should be held outside the palace in unison with a similar prayer meeting inside, and this showed that her belief that God hears prayer and that He is a very present help in time of trouble. And this noble woman is actually resolved, if necessary, to sacrifice her life for the very sake of her people. If I perish, I perish, she says. And the king could have definitely chosen to have her killed. Verse 17. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Notes. Well, this is kind of unfortunate, but far too many modern believers in a time of trouble are taught to turn to anything and everything except for God. The results are plainly obvious. We have churches that are shutting down by the thousands. Chapter 5. Now it came to pass on the third day of the fast, that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. Notes. She's right there in plain sight where the king could see her. Verse 2. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Notes. Well, of course, this was no doubt the customary act by which the king's grace was accepted or not accepted. Life and death right there by the king's very own hand. Verse 3. Then said the king unto her, What will you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? It shall be given you up to half the kingdom. Verse 4. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Notes. Now concerning this, the preacher known as Williams says, Esther's intelligence and tact were very admirable. Her life and that of her people hung on a very thread. She was playing with edged tools, and the slightest mistake would have been fatal. To invite the king to a banquet was a masterstroke of policy. And to include his favorite minister Haman in the invitation was not only an added evidence of skill and of a deep knowledge of human nature, but it was, at the same time, a very clever plan to getting Haman into her power. No doubt the Lord had told her exactly what to do. Well, that's not his opinion. It's not my opinion, but that's what Williams wrote. But anyways, and so it is. Verse 5. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is your petition? And it shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Notes. Now, by a king saying something as drastic as this, it's like he's picking up that Esther had something more in mind than what was now being done. He must have known that she must have had some kind of real favor that she wants him to grant. Therefore, he repeats the inquiry and the promise that he made previously. Verse 7. Then Esther answered and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, And to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Notes. In other words, I will make known tomorrow my actual request. The repetition of her invitation showed extraordinary wisdom. I mean, boy, what I wouldn't do to have a woman like that in my life. At the first banquet, the king rightly divined that some important matter was laying behind this invitation. Otherwise, why should Esther risk her life by coming uninvited into his presence? It was surely not merely to invite him and Haman to dinner. There's something much bigger behind the curtain. Well, Esther, by repeating the invitation and postponing the secret petition, he enhanced its importance for a while, and at the same time she increased her personal interest in the king's affections and more deeply excited his curiosity. Furthermore, she more effectually threw Haman off his guard and so secured his fall. She's doing a real good job of buttering them both up. Verse 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordicai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordicai. Notes. Mordicai was showing utter contempt for Haman by not even acknowledging his presence, and this proud knucklehead was infuriated by it. Verse 10. Nevertheless, Haman maintained his composure, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. Notes. Well, it was a plot now to know what to do with Mordecai. In other words, killing him would not be enough. He wanted Mordecai's death to be an absolute spectacle. Such a wicked man. Verse 11. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, Moreover, ye, Esther the queen, did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited into her also with the king. Verse 13, and here we have the spectacle that Haman has been plotting. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends with him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And this thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Notes. Well, he talks it over with his wife, and they come up with a plan or a solution to his problem, or so he thinks. They have a gallows made, and well, they just think that their problems are going to be resolved, and now Haman is pretty sure of himself. Oh, the irony of what happens to him. Where are we now? Hold on just a second. Chapter 6, okay. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Notes. Oh, my personal opinion, the Holy Spirit no doubt placed this in the king's mind as well to have the record read. Okay, verse 2. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity has been done unto Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, There is nothing done for him. Notes. Well, Mordecai had basically he saved the king's life. And had Mordecai complained at the time that he saved the king's life in chapter 2, verse 21, verses 23, of the non-recognition of his services, he would have lost the extraordinary honors recorded in this chapter. Okay? It is always better and more dignified not to seek for human recognition, but to walk in fellowship with God, doing one's duties. And, of course, waiting for the honor that comes from above. And it will surely come, as this chapter certainly proves. If you look out for God, He will look out for you. And that's what's been happening. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house, to speak unto the king, to hang Mordicai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Notes, well, no doubt this was the next morning, and then you just got to keep in mind that Haman is just so happy. Boy, he's just skipping around the gardens. He's just having a fun time thinking that the world is just his little bivalve mollusk. It's not going to work out that way. Verse 5, "And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman stands in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. And so Haman did come in. And the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart literally, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head." Notes. Haman's basically thinking it's going to be him, and the insignia of the crown on the horse's head, not the head of the man, of course. But anyways, verse 9. "And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal from the king's delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Notes. Boy, if Haman only knew what he was really setting himself up for. He thinks it's going to be him, but actually he is giving orders for Mordicai to be treated this way. And oh, it only gets more humiliating. Trust me. Verse 10. "Then the king said to Haman, Make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as you have said, and do even so to Mordicai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and let nothing fail of all of that you have spoken." Notes. Now, can you imagine what this man must have been thinking when the king said this should be done to Mordicai, when all the time he thought it was for himself? Considering some of the things that the Lord does, and He definitely did this, we must come to the conclusion that the Lord does have a sense of humor. Only God could work a situation in this type of manner. Verse 11. "Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordicai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor." Notes. Haman had backed himself into a really, really big corner. There was no ground on which he could decline this task that was thrust upon him. So he does exactly what the king has commanded to be done, as galling as it must have been. Also, Mordecai must have been just as pleasantly surprised as Haman had been whenever he was just totally dejected. Boy, he's eating his own words by the mouthful. Verse 12, "And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having a head covered." Notes. Now, this is also one of those signs of very, very acute rejection. Okay? All this time he thought that this was all going to be done for him, and everything he was dreaming of for that day just shattered like a mirror all over the place. And we will pick up in chapter 6, verse 13 of the Book of Esther. Thank you, and God bless.